Well, thank everybody for coming. I hope you're not here just for the food. And I first wanted to ask everybody, who here went to the presentation yesterday on how to get a job as a prosecutor? Well, I'll tell you that probably, and I wasn't there, a lot of what you learned yesterday will carry over to today, because one of the best and most traditional paths of becoming a successful criminal defense attorney is to first start as a prosecutor. So that's one path we'll be discussing today. Kind of the theme of what I want to talk about is there's not just one path to success as a criminal defense attorney. So if you come up with a plan in your career and you come up against a closed door at some point, don't let that be the end of your quest if you're seeking a job as a criminal defense attorney. There are a lot of ways to do it. There's a traditional path, or a couple traditional paths that we're going to talk about it. But there are also non-traditional paths to becoming a criminal defense attorney. And that was, to a large degree, my experience and some other people that I talked to. In preparation for today, I actually have been on the phone and I called a lot of different criminal defense attorneys that have taken a lot of different paths in their careers and have worked in a lot of different locations. So I talked to people who are partners at criminal defense firms. I talked to people who are solo practitioners. I talked to people who started as a prosecutor and transitioned over. I talked to people in the federal public defender's office, both new hires and people who do the hiring. And I talked to someone in the state or in the county public defender's office in Texas. And this is in Dallas, in Houston, in Austin, and in Lubbock. So I wanted to try to kind of get a whole mass of information and see what common themes started to arise. So I'm going to try to give that to you guys because one person's experience, just my experience or just Charles's experience, would give you one part of the picture, but one of the things you want to do is to talk to a lot of different people and see what they did and what worked for them. But I'll tell you that there's a few themes that seem to come up time and time again. So I'm going to try to emphasize that. So here's some of the things we're going to talk about today. What is the typical characteristic of a criminal defense attorney? And what I'm trying to get at here is this for me? That's a question you might be asking yourself. Is this a good fit for me? So we'll be talking about that a little bit. We'll be talking about some of the different options for employment. You know, you might see someone that works at a criminal defense firm, but there are a lot of other ways to practice criminal defense. So what are your options there? And then I think the third one is the question that kind of you want to know. What can I be doing now to prepare myself to have the best possible success in not only getting a job as a criminal defense attorney, but then being a successful criminal defense attorney? And then we'll also talk about hiring practices, but I think Part 3 and Part 4 I'll kind of lump together. Okay, so what are the characteristics of a criminal defense attorney? Well, this is something I actually was given or found, and this is something that you'll kind of see listed in a lot of different places. And I think this would apply to a lot of different areas of the law or the practice of law. But you're typically going to be someone who's going to be quick in the courtroom. That skill is important. Someone who's a capable negotiator, someone who believes in what they're doing, defending the Constitution, and passion for justice is important in a lot of these. But I made kind of a similar slide. I'm not going to read these. That I think touches on some of the things that were true to my experience. And this gets at the question that I want you to always ask yourself, and I think it's an important question: is this for me? In other words, am I cut out to be a criminal defense attorney? And I wanted to kind of pass along some of my own experiences here of how it affected me. And you see people that really, really thrive in this area. But you also will see from time to time people who burn out in this area because it's not really for them. And perhaps they never asked themselves this question. And kind of as a side note, this is a question that you'll want to ask yourself no matter what area of law you go into. Before I got into criminal defense full-time, I did insurance defense for 3 years working for a law firm. So I was defending people who were sued in personal injury cases, and I was being paid by insurance companies. And I perhaps never asked myself the question ahead of time, is this for me? Because after working there for about 2.5 years, I realized it was not for me. And I got a lot of good experience, and I would recommend that to get litigation experience. But had I asked myself the question more honestly early on, I would have come to an answer that criminal defense is for me, and I feel very confident about that now. Okay? So the people that I've seen that are successful, happy, rewarded criminal defense attorneys are people who tend to have kind of an inexplicable sense of calling for this type of work. Or sometimes they'll describe it as a passion for this type of work. And for example, I talked to someone at the Harris County Public Defender's Office yesterday, and she said, this is hard work. It can be very stressful at times, but I just have a passion for it, and I wouldn't want to be doing anything else. It's very similar to when you talk to people who have children and you ask them if they're happy, and the answer is, they'll just tell you all these things that make them unhappy about having children. But at the end of it, they'll say, but it's totally worth it. But they can't really explain why. And that's because there's something deeper there. And I think that this is something that exists within criminal defense attorneys. Okay? And the reason you want to have that passion or kind of feed that passion is because there's a lot of disappointment in criminal defense. And the disappointment can be very, very emotionally taxing. And the reason you experience this is because your clients are facing very, very dire circumstances at the hands of the criminal justice system. And oftentimes the criminal justice system does not seem very just. You'll meet people who have sometimes done very bad things in their lives, but you will get to know them, and you will get to know their families, and you will inevitably come to the conclusion that what they've done doesn't really reflect on them as a person as a whole. And that will inspire you to want to do the best for them, to give them as much time back with their families as you can. And oftentimes, or at least not always, are you successful. And you have to have those difficult conversations, and you have to tell them, this is what you're facing, this is what your experience is. I can help you the best I can, but I can't always save you from these circumstances or from these consequences. So that can be very taxing. Of course, on the flip side is when you have positive results in criminal defense, it's incredibly uplifting. And you don't need to have a big result that often to really carry you through your career. I've talked to attorneys who practice in front of judges and in communities that are very, very kind of tough justice, law and order communities. And they'll see client after client really go away in a long time in a way that feels unjust to them. But they'll say, I just need that good result even once every 6 months, and that keeps me going in the job. And that's really a testament to how rewarding and uplifting it can be when you can tell one of your clients, you were facing 10 years away from your kids, and now you get to spend the next 10 years with your kids. I hope to never see you again. And what I mean by that is I hope you're never my client again. And sometimes it can be hard because they will be your client again, and they didn't learn from their lesson. But it's really, in a lot of ways, an emotional roller coaster. So you have to ask yourself, is that for me? One of the ways you can kind of get through the difficult times, and this is true in life, in my opinion, is you always want to be judging your performance and not your results. Your job is to advocate for your client the very best you can. And that's true not just for advocating for a client, that's true here in law school. Did I learn as much as I could in that class? Well, if you end up not being happy with your grade, you can still be happy with your performance in the sense of learning, right? And that's true with anything. So I always ask myself, so I will go to argue at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals from time to time. And I find that to be a fairly hostile court toward people who represent people who have been convicted of a crime. right? By the time I'm there, my client is already convicted or has already pleaded guilty. And I experience a lot of hostility there. And it's not from every judge, but from many of them. And it's very, very difficult for us to win at the Fifth Circuit, even when we should win, and even when we would win in most other circuits, right? So how do I get myself through that? Well, I always am telling myself, I'm going to go give the best presentation of my case I possibly can. And if I've successfully communicated to that court why they should rule in my client's favor, and they understand it, it's up to them what they ultimately decide. But I'm judging my performance and not my result, and that's preventing me from being burned out. Okay? Here's something you should know, and I really like this. Criminal defense attorneys can be kind of rough around the edges. In my experience working with civil attorneys, it's a little bit stuffier than working with criminal defense attorneys, where you deal with people who speak frankly, people who tend to be, I would say, more authentic, people who put their cards on the table a little bit quicker. And I really, really enjoy the legal community, other criminal defense attorneys, just really, really good people. And there's also a very close community. Criminal defense attorneys will have associations, and Charles will talk more about that. The Lubbock County Criminal Defense Association, for example, is notorious for being, or I wouldn't say notorious, it's known for being a very tight-knit group of criminal defense attorneys that really help each other out and are really go to bat for each other. And being part of a community like that can be really, really rewarding. Just as this kind of an aside, but criminal defense attorneys, in my experience, tend to be kind of one of two types politically. Tend to be quite liberal, kind of your bleeding heart type. That's probably more where I am. And but I have coworkers who tend to have much more of a libertarian kind of fight the man disposition. Almost everyone I know in criminal defense falls into one of these categories. So I just want to put that out there. You might ask yourself, am I compatible with working with these people? Okay. One of the most interesting comments I ever had said to me, and this is when I worked at the law firm, one of my bosses, he said, the practice of law is spending a life of collecting stories. And that really, really is true, especially if you work in litigation, where you're going to have clients, you're going to be involved in conflict, and you're going to be seeking resolutions of conflict. And it makes for a very, very interesting way to spend your time. And I would say criminal defense is maybe kind of the pinnacle of that. I mean, criminal defense attorneys, a group of them sitting at the bar, drinking beer, telling war stories can be one of the most interesting experiences you can have, because everybody has just so many interesting stories. Charles and I were just telling stories before this thing today. He was telling me about a case he has at the Court of Appeals, and I was telling him about a suppression hearing I had in district court yesterday. And we could probably spend an hour just talking about those two cases, and those were just our most recent cases. Okay. One of the things I also like about criminal defense is you get an opportunity to use a lot of different forms of advocacy. A lot of opportunities to be in the courtroom for hearings. You'll have, especially if you do state criminal defense work, a lot of opportunities to get trial experience. But you also will have opportunities to use written advocacy. For example, when you seek to suppress evidence, that will begin in the form of a written motion to suppress. And then it'll be followed up by an evidentiary hearing where you get to cross-examine witnesses and call your own witnesses and put on evidence. So you get the kind of the full range, and then you follow that up with a legal argument to the judge as to why they should suppress the evidence. And so you get this blend of moot court and mock trial, and all the while, even before that suppression hearing, right after, and then later on in the case, you're negotiating with the prosecutors about how can we work out a deal here. Sometimes you can reach a deal, sometimes you can't. So in the suppression hearing that I had yesterday, which we won, by the way, it was the afternoon before that I was in the prosecutor's, the U.S. Attorney's office up on the 7th floor of our building, have a meeting with them, explaining to them why I think this was a bad search and why they shouldn't proceed with this, and kind of breaking it down for them. And ultimately, they decided to go forward. But there was kind of a real negotiation that was happening at that time. Okay? The last thing, contrary to common belief, you will absolutely be able to sleep at night. This is one of the silliest things I've ever heard anyone say. And you will hear this from time to time as a criminal defense attorney. How can you sleep at night? You represent all of those terrible people. And the answer is, once I'm doing criminal defense, I've never had an issue with my conscience even once. Perhaps that's because it's right for me. Perhaps that's because I'm cut out for it. But I was much more conflicted when I was doing insurance defense, making sure that legitimately injured people received no money for their medical bills. Now I think of it as I'm giving people's time in life back to them and trying to fight against what I think is an unjust system. And this is even people who have done bad things. People will say, what do you do when you find out that your client is guilty? How do you continue to defend them? My answer is, I don't think I've ever actually defended an innocent person. And it's the guilty people and the innocent people. Everyone needs to have this representation, needs to have someone fight for them. And doing that is incredibly rewarding. And the sleeping at night is not an issue. In fact, I would be tempted to ask a prosecutor how they sleep at night. Just in the sense of, because what they do in their mind is making society a safer place. And perhaps that is true sometimes. But also part of doing that is to take people away from their families, take people away from their kids. And that once you get to know those people and know them as people and not as just the crime they've committed, it seems like there's a better way. Okay. What's inspired me? What might inspire you? This is a book I read prior to going into law school. When I went to law school, I wanted to be a prosecutor. By the way, I worked at the Travis County Attorney's Office with a bunch of prosecutors for 2 years before I went to law school. I was what was called a victim witness coordinator. So I worked with the officers. I talked to all the victims of crimes, the ones that had victims, and I helped to get justice on behalf of Travis County. And this book was one of the things that really changed my perspective. And it's the story of Clarence Gideon. And I advise you to look him up. It's one of the most interesting and important stories in legal history. And it's written by a journalist who followed the story as it was happening. Okay. Why is it important to know if it's cut out for you? Because you will be handling a lot of different cases. And especially when you're starting out, you're not really going to be turning away a lot of cases. Although one piece of advice I've gotten from a lot of experienced attorneys is don't have the arrogance when you start out to just feel like, oh, I'm going to take a first-degree felony all by myself, and I'm not going to reach out to some of my mentors at the law school. I'm not going to reach out to other people in the legal community and say, hey, can you help me? What am I missing here? So one of the big pieces of advice is to have this social interaction with other people in the criminal defense community. Okay? But there are a lot of different cases, and you will have, if you spend a career in criminal defense, you will work on all of these cases at some point or in some capacity. So I've worked in some capacity, usually as lead counsel, everything from a Class C misdemeanor to I had some work on a death penalty case, and then everything in between. So I've been lead counsel in a first-degree felony in state court, very serious offenses in federal court, obviously, and everything in between. So you get to touch a lot of these bases very, very quickly. And that also makes it really, really interesting because every type of case you have to think about differently. And even when it's the same type of case, the facts are going to be different. You have to think about them differently. And that type of variety really, really makes for an interesting career. Okay, what types of employment do we have? Well, you can work for a public defender's office, you can work in private practice, or you can work in public interest. So these are your main options. I work for the Federal Public Defender's Office. We don't have a state public defender's office in Texas. They do have one in New Mexico, which is an excellent place for experience. But we do have localized county public defender's offices in Texas, which can be incredibly good for experience, either as an intern or later as a career. Although I've been told that they, like the federal public defenders, they don't hire people straight out of law school. It would be very rare that they do. Okay. So another option you have, just a major category, is going to be a criminal defense firm, which would be not very common. There's not a lot of those. But solo practitioner, which would be incredibly common, and our special guest here is going to talk about that and his experiences with that. And then a big thing is kind of informal collaborations, where you have solo practitioners that maybe share office space together, they refer cases to each other, they will second chair on each other's cases. And one of the consistent themes I keep hearing talking to other attorneys is, get involved with this. You don't have to start a firm with people, but form relationships through these defense lawyer associations with other people in your community. You know, if you don't have a lot of experience, you're just starting out, you've got some misdemeanors, but someone you know is defending a murder trial, you know, you might reach out and say, hey, I don't have a lot of experience, but could I second chair that case with you? Or can I sit in? Or is there anything I can do to help? And you start forming that relationship, and before you know it, you'll be the one first chairing a murder trial. Okay? And then public interest, and you'll hear about this, Innocence Project, legal aid, things like that. Okay. So, I'm not going to go into the history of the Federal Public Defender's Office. It's very, very interesting, but that's not going to be a place you're going to get your first job very often. Okay? That might also be true with the Regional Public Defender's Office, but I talked to someone who did get a job basically right out of law school at the Harris County Public Defender's Office, and her experiences were, again, one of the consistent themes, and I'm going to get to this at the end, but kind of the most important thing you can do is a combination of experience and forming relationships, okay? So the best thing you can possibly do is to find a way to intern at the place you ultimately want to work, okay? And do a really good job. And even if you don't get a job there, that can lead to other opportunities. Or years later, you're still remembered when an opening suddenly comes up. And I hear this story so many times, that you get a call out of the blue. Hey, we've got this opening. I remember when you worked here, you were really good. Hey, would you think about applying? I think you should apply. And that leads to a lot of jobs in criminal defense at something like a public defender. Okay? Okay. I wanted to give you a quick, before I throw it to Charles, I wanted to give you kind of the profile of several different people I talked to, and to try to demonstrate to you the multiple paths to success as a criminal defense attorney. And to really underline one of the main points I'm making is that there's no one path. Okay? Everyone in this room can be a successful criminal defense attorney. And you can all start out in different places and still end up being a successful criminal defense attorney. It's a question of whether it's something you're passionate about, something you want to do, something you're cut out for, and something you're willing to work hard and overcome adversity along the way. Okay? Person one, this is a good friend of mine. Made really good grades in law school, wrote into a journal, did OCI, did a federal clerkship, got a super job making tons of money. Okay? Again, on paper, this is everybody's dream. He did not like it. He did not enjoy his life. In the meantime, someone at his firm was reached out to, and there was a case going to the U.S. Supreme Court. And they said, hey, can your firm kind of work with us, help us moot this case? You're already here in Washington. We're going to come up here and meet with some other people. And he got super involved on a pro bono basis working with this case. In fact, he got so involved and impressed so many people that the Federal Public Defender's Office said, hey, is there anything we can do to get you to come work for us? And ultimately that ended up happening. Okay? So I would say this would be a very somewhat non-traditional path, But you go down one way and you don't have to commit to that for the rest of your life. And you start to get a feeling that you want to go somewhere else, and you take advantage of opportunities as they arise. Okay? My story is kind of a lighter version of this. I worked for a civil litigation firm and then started developing a criminal practice on the side and found opportunities to get involved in other ways and eventually transitioned to criminal defense full-time. Okay, person 2 made okay grades in law school, right? We're not talking about top 10% here, but someone, smart. They decided they wanted to focus on advocacy, board of barristers type stuff instead of a journal. They had learned Spanish. They had studied it in college. It's hard to just learn Spanish while you're in law school, but that's something that's really important in criminal defense. They interned at an immigration firm. And as you'll know, there's a lot of overlap, especially in the federal system, between immigration law and criminal law. They got really involved in the criminal clinic. This is another major theme I keep hearing when I talk to people. While you're in law school, get that practical experience. Everybody that I've talked to would recommend that you get involved with a clinical program while in law school. Okay, that's good advice. And was hired shortly out of law school for a job they normally don't hire shortly after law school on some very strong recommendations and on this combination of immigration experience, clinical experience, and Spanish speaking. Okay, so taking these different skills they had developed and combining them into a really, really good applicant. This was another path that someone took. This is also a good friend of mine. Okay. Person 3. I don't know what kind of grades they made in law school. They've never told me. Focused on advocacy instead of a journal. This person worked as a prosecutor for several years after law school and got a bunch of grunt work experience at the beginning, which probably was not fun, but eventually got a lot of trial experience. Then they transitioned to criminal defense. They opened their own office by themselves, did that for many years, and then got interested in federal criminal law. And one of the things that we not only have a federal public defender's office, but something called the Criminal Justice Act also allows people in private criminal defense practice to be able to get appointed to federal cases. Okay? And so they started taking some federal cases when they could. And all of a sudden, an opening comes up, and the office needs kind of someone who can start immediately and already know everything, doesn't really need to get trained that much, and they were recruited to come in. So this is a person that, again, set themselves up for success in a different way. Okay, person 4. I don't know what kind of grades they made. They did advocacy. They got super involved in the criminal clinic. Again, a consistent theme. They did tons of networking, and they were able to get an internship at the Harris County Public Defender's Office. They were told, we never, ever, ever hire anyone out of law school. So enjoy interning. I hope you get some good experience, but you're going to have to go work elsewhere. As their internship was ending, they had impressed so many people, and out of nowhere, some openings that needed to be filled arose, and the people started saying, well, I guess maybe we'll make one exception. We really, really want you to stay on. And they did, and they love it, and they're super happy. Okay, I talked to this person yesterday. Okay, person 5, really involved in criminal clinic, opened their own office out of law school, got super involved at the local bar association, made relationships, tried cases with other attorneys, formed an informal association with other lawyers to look out for each other, and continues to do that and wouldn't do anything else because they're very successful and very happy. And this person told me that they wanted me to tell you that everyone is capable of starting their own solo criminal defense practice and being successful. You need to reach out to other people who have done it and ask them for advice, take them to lunch, let them mentor you. But this is not something that you need to be scared of. So that's what they really wanted me. I would be scared to do this. Okay? We all are, right? Because you're taking a risk. But so many people have done this, and if you're willing to work hard, everyone can make a living as a solo criminal defense attorney. That's possible for everyone. In fact, one of the most interesting other pieces of advice I have when I was working at Travis County Attorney's Office way back in the day, one of my bosses, who's now the first assistant there, so way high up, said, one of the things I love about criminal defense is if I got fired today, I could start taking cases tomorrow as a criminal defense attorney. And it's just that type of job security, or that gives you a certain confidence, knowing that you can always get clients because you can always get appointments, and then you can always start building a reputation to get other paid clients. Okay? I've identified 5 paths to practicing criminal defense, in my opinion. And these are not in order of priority necessarily. One path is to start as a prosecutor and then transition into criminal defense, either as a firm or solo practitioner. A second path is to start with a state or county public defender's office and get that kind of same type of high volume experience, but on the criminal defense side. A third path that's very common is open your own solo practice and develop it. Fourth path is intern and then apply to a criminal defense firm. I talked to a partner at a criminal defense firm that's been around for a long time, and he said every person I've ever hired had previously interned or clerked for me. Okay, so that's very different than a big civil litigation firm who's just going to be hiring new people out of law school, although they often will hire from an intern pool as well. But especially with these smaller criminal defense firms, they're always going to be hiring former interns and clerks. And then you could do kind of what I did and my friend did, take a job with a civil firm if that's where you end up, and then start developing your own criminal defense practice internally and then see if you have a passion for it. Okay? All of these paths can lead to equal success. So remember that, and remember to work on your research and writing, remember to work on your advocacy, but all the while, don't forget the importance of networking and getting that practical, real-world experience. And with that in mind, I want to throw it to our special guest who has a lot of this experience that's different from mine, Charles Blevins.
Sure. How are y'all? Let me give you a little bit of background of myself so you can understand why I made some of the decisions I did. I grew up very poor in the projects, and then I got very lucky. I guess in '99, I moved to Austin for an IT job and lived there for about 10 years, developing a consulting practice that I gave up to go to law school because I wanted to be a criminal defense attorney. It's what I knew I wanted to do going into law school. I say fortunate, other people say no, you worked for it, but I actually got hired by a firm. I first moved out, graduated law school, and I chose to stay in Lubbock instead of going back to Austin because, as Brandon said, the bar had such a good reputation here, the group of lawyers. It's a model for the other criminal defense associations across the state. They'll come here and meet with our organization to learn about how we do things and how they can take that back. But I started to rent space somewhere when I was first out of law school, and I was going to go solo. And after a few months, I got very lucky. As Brandon talked about, I would go down to the courthouse every week because I didn't have a lot of business, so I had a lot of free time at that time. And I would ask the court, who's going to trial next week? And they would tell me, and I would call that lawyer, and I would say, can I sit with you? And I was never told no. And I got very lucky, wasn't lucky at the time, but I got very lucky. I was sitting on a murder with a much older attorney who had a health scare. And the client had filed a motion for speedy trial, and he didn't care who tried the case. And so it was the first time I'd actually first chaired a case, was a murder case. At that time, and it still is the highest sentence I've ever received, it was 18 years. It was the first time in Lubbock that the sudden passion defense actually worked. And so I knew then that I had made the right choice, that it was my passion. And I will stress this because that in turn, where I was at, one of the firms here, and as Brandon said, there's not a lot of criminal defense firms. You will find people either work at a public defender or they're solo, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I got very fortunate that a firm here approached me and said, hey, do you want to come work for us? And I immediately jumped on it. I know sitting there, because I was there once, I had no idea who were good lawyers, who were bad lawyers, who you shouldn't follow. But I was told, look, the person who's approached you, he's basically a legend here and across the state. You're very fortunate. Take it. And so I did. And I worked there for 4 years, and I enjoyed every moment of it. When I worked in IT, I loved it, but there were days where I didn't want to go to work. There's never been a day like that as a criminal defense lawyer. There are days that are hard, and I may not look forward to, but I get up every morning and love what I do. It's a passion. And when I talk to other lawyers who are just starting out, baby lawyers, as we call them, where I'm at now, I'm solo and I have 2 offices. Baby lawyers love to come over there in office for a few weeks or a month, and I will give them guidance, but I won't work with a baby lawyer that I don't feel has the passion. It's immediate and it's known. You may not have it when you first get out, but if you don't develop that passion, and as Brandon said, it's going to be true in any type of law, you're going to be miserable. In criminal defense, some of the best advice I ever received, and I won't use the explicit way they said it, but they said, go to the bar tonight and ask every girl there out so that you can learn what it's like to be told no. Because that's what criminal defense, that's what it's like. You're going to, as Brandon said, feel that your arguments are so strong. Law school kind of has this belief, you get this belief that the Supreme Court's there to protect your rights, etc. It's actually quite the opposite. So you have to get used to defeat from judges, from prosecutors who feel they're righteous and you're on the wrong side. But I will tell you, I have yet to meet a client that I wouldn't leave alone with my own children. And I've tried cases everywhere from murder down to Class Cs. I had a client recently who was accused of, well, he was convicted, so we can't say accused anymore, but he had went into his neighbor's house, robbed her, and attempted to sexually assault her. He was probably one of my most favorite clients. And when he was sentenced, I remember I cried at the defense table, not because I had quote-unquote lost, but because I knew he was going away and I wouldn't get to see him very often anymore. And he gave me words of advice as he was being handcuffed. That's the type of work that we do. There's this question of, well, how do you sleep at night? One lawyer said, well, you answer that by on a pillow of $100 bills. But that's not my take. One of the very, very first cases I ever was lucky enough to sit second chair was a guy who had a long criminal history. And he got into a shootout on Whataburger on 4th. And he had a gun, he took off running, someone called the cops, and they had trapped him in the alley, and he pulled the gun and tried to shoot the cop. It was aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. And I did some of the cross, and I did the closing. And I took his long history, and I stuck it in front of the jury, sheet by sheet by sheet. And I said, look, the first thing this kid ever got in trouble for was stealing food from Walmart. This kid has been this way his whole life. He's been trapped in this alley his whole life. And the jury gave him 10, which there was a cop's wife on the jury. And afterwards, the kid started crying. He said, no one's ever fought for me before. And that's really what it's like to be a criminal defense attorney. The hardest part is actually not, and I've tried, and I don't say this to boast, but I try at least 6 to 10 cases a year. Last year I tried 5. It was the least amount I ever tried as first chair. The hardest part is it's not sitting next to your client, because if you're at trial and your client's sitting next to you and they've not invested confidence in you, then you're doing something wrong. So anytime I'm at trial, I believe that my client believes in me and I believe in them. But the actual hardest part is when you look over their shoulder into the gallery and there's nobody there. And I can tell you that most trials I've had, that's the case. And it gives you a real sense, a realization that you're all that person has. And that's one thing that I stress to baby lawyers, and why some baby lawyers say that I can be a real ass to them when I find out what they've done in a case. Because most of the time, you're that person's last hope. They don't get visits from family. They don't see anybody but you. And if you do a bad job, then there's nothing left for them. And so how I sleep at night is when I go to bed, I think about, did I do the very best that I could for my client? There's not been a single time where a former client has murdered somebody in my family, where a former client has robbed me, hurt me, threatened me, or have I seen a former client that I think just went and did something because they're psychopaths. Every client that I've ever had, from murder all the way down, typically it's because they were either in love, they were very angry, they were desperate, or they were on drugs. It's very rare. I've only ever had one client who simply set out that day and said, you know what, I'm going to go out today and I'm going to break the law. It just doesn't happen. So when you go and you look for a job as a criminal defense attorney, especially with public defenders, the Harris County for sure, that's what they look for. They look for somebody who has that passion, who understands you're not going to fail so long as you do what you need to do and you do right by your clients. The attorney that I worked for, he has a reputation of being extremely mean and hard to work for. And that's true, but he always stressed to do the right thing. And he never once ever got on to me for my ability as an attorney because he always knew I was trying to do the right thing. And I truly believe that any type of job you get as a criminal defense attorney, if you're working for the right people, that's what you'll be judged on. And that's what will be if you keep your job or not. It's not your wins or losses at trial. It's not how much money you bring in to a certain extent, because you got to eat. But it's, are you doing the right thing? I guess it's obvious, but most of the attorneys I know are criminal defense attorneys. And like Brandon, I know many who have gone through different paths. It's not a career where you can go to OCI typically and you're going to find somebody who's seeking a criminal defense attorney. It just doesn't happen. And sometimes people are turned away from that because they want a job. They didn't know what they wanted to do when they went to law school. They're kind of floating through law school, making the grade and say, look, I'm just going to show up to OCI, apply somewhere, and then get the job. As Brandon kind of talked about, and I've kind of mentioned, I'm solo now, and it's kind of like kids. There's never a good time to have kids. You will always find a reason not to have one if you think about it. So starting your own practice is kind of like kids. Unless you're just like broke, you shouldn't be doing it. Starting your practice or having kids, but there's not going to be a good time to start one than now. I owe a lot to Metz, who's sitting back there. I did his clinic, and I can tell you, leaving his clinic, I felt pretty confident from day one, once I got my bar card, that I could start practicing. You heard me talk a lot about Lubbock. I'm from Austin, and like I said, I chose to stay here because of the bar and the resources. For some reason, a lot of people who go to law school have this idea that lawyers are competitive with each other. I can tell you, at least here, that's not my experience. There's a huge, what they say, big-time defense attorney out of Houston, Mark Thiessen, who came and tried a case here back in August. And our lawyers are so good, he ended up marrying one and taking her back to Houston. But he was impressed with how well the bar was here. He had run into an issue with an officer and needed some information, and he was thoroughly impressed with how quick we could help him. And ultimately, he got a not guilty in an intox manslaughter. And he comes back every year to our prairie dog and talks because of that, or one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons. So I will stress to you, and I've seen it with a lot of baby lawyers, and you can kind of correlate some of their success or not success with this. Don't get your bar card, throw up a shingle, and not talk to other attorneys, because you're going to not fail. You won't realize you're failing until another attorney gets your repeat client and realizes how bad of a job you did with their first case. So those would really be the two biggest things, because I know we're running out of time, but when you go to intern, apply, is make it known that you're receptive to advice, that you're willing to listen to people who have been there. Law school will teach you a lot about the law, and I can stand up here and only tell you so much about the practice of law, but it's kind of like studying baseball. Until you get to that plate and swing the bat, it's not going to really matter, or you're not really going to realize the gravity. And then the second, as you've heard me say over and over, it's a passion. You either enter into it, or you've got to get that passion real quick. And if you don't, the right thing to do is just stop being a criminal defense lawyer, because it's a loaded gun that you're playing with. And that's somebody's life. I often joke that there's no collaterals with murder. It's true. You can get convicted of murder and actually have less what we call collaterals. You won't lose your driver's license. You won't lose funding, financial aid to a certain extent. And actually, you might have an easier time finding a job if you can explain why you have murder. But you get popped with possession of marijuana and you lose your driver's license, you have surcharges, and there's negative connotations with drugs. And so I stress that when you get out and you go solo, don't think, well, I'll just take low-level misdemeanors, I'll be fine, I don't need to talk to anybody. It's actually quite the opposite. You can do more harm and damage realistically on those low-level misdemeanors. So I would say when you go in, make it known that you know what you don't know and you're willing to learn and use that passion. And I can't imagine most public defenders' offices turning that away. We have 5 minutes left. I assume Brandon's going to come ask. Are there any questions for either one of us?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you the 30-second version of my experience. After my first year of law school, I interned at the Federal Public Defender's Office, the same office I work in now. I did other criminal defense work later. I ended up doing civil litigation. When the federal government went into sequestration in 2013, they didn't have enough lawyers to take some of these federal criminal appeals. I was able to get some at that opportunity and develop kind of a portfolio of work I had done. And then I had heard through a friend that there were some openings, and ultimately I applied. I ended up having to apply again, and then was able to get the job at the very place I first interned. So it's just kind of like you're planting those seeds, and then you just keep an open mind and keep your options open.
Yeah, I mean, Brandon pretty much said what I said, but I will just say this. If you go to work somewhere because you simply applied and they don't know you, they don't know your passion, they don't know your capabilities, you're going to start to doubt how well you're going to succeed there or how well you're going to get along there. No matter what type of law or what type of job, you typically want to be hired because that person realizes your potential and your passion. I don't care if it's fruit law, water law, space law, or criminal defense. Make sure when you go get a job that that person or that firm realizes the potential that you have and the passion that you have. Otherwise, you're going to feel like it's a day in and day out, punch the clock kind of job. And yes, you're a lawyer. Your mom can go to the store and tell her friends you're a lawyer, but you're not going to like it. And so I don't care what kind of law it is, make sure that that's the way you feel when you go get that job.
And we'll take some more questions out in the hallway, or I'll put it this way. We'll take some more questions over in the Lanier area, the lobby, if you guys want to come up to us. But we'll let the next class get started.